Hi, and thanks for listening. My name is Nicholson Price. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan Law School. I'm also affiliated with the Project on Precision Medicine, Artificial Intelligence, and the Law at Harvard Medical School, and with the Center for Advanced Studies in Biomedical Innovation Law at the University of Copenhagen. I'll be talking today about legal regimes and the spectrum of medical AI and machine learning. First off, a couple of disclaimers. I have no relevant financial interests. More importantly, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm definitely not your lawyer. So you shouldn't take anything that I say here today as legal advice. All right, so let's start with a roadmap. And the first thing I want to say is this project is not just me. This is a project with two wonderful co-authors. In the upper right, you can see Becky Eisenberg, who is a professor also at the University of Michigan Law School. And at the lower right, you can see Rachel Sachs, who is a professor of law at Washington University in St. Louis. So today, I want to start by talking about kind of what we think of as the standard health or law and health tech innovation model. What are the big policy levers? What are the big regimes that matter to the development of health technology? And then I want to shift over to talk about medical AI. First, starting with who's innovating and how does that interact with that standard model? And then the spectrum of different kinds of AI and machine learning that's involved in the healthcare project. Then I'll talk about how the various types of different medical AI mean that the legal regimes that apply pretty neatly in the standard model don't apply in the same way here. And in fact, lead to some pretty profound changes, at least we think, in the development of medical AI in this context. And some potential problems going forward. So I'll talk first about FDA, the Federal Food and Drug Administration, then the patent system, and then insurance. And I'll finish up with some implications a little bit more broadly. One prefatory note, this project is a ways along, but still very much in development. So if you think to yourself as you're listening, that sounds weird, or that sounds wrong, or my experience doesn't gel with that, frankly, we would love to hear from you. All right, so I'll start by talking about the kind of, or at least a kind of standard law and health tech model. What are the legal regimes that really shape innovation? And when I say standard, what I really mean is think about things like drugs or physical medical devices, implantable pacemakers, hip implants, X-ray machines, that kind of stuff. So I think about three big regimes showing up, and I won't be surprised because I've already mentioned them. The first, of course, is the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, regulates about a quarter of the United States economy and tends to, at least in the kind of mill run case here, tends to approve these products. So particularly for drugs, right? FDA approves all drugs before they can be sold. For devices, FDA has a little bit more of a risk-tiered framework. It goes through a full pre-market approval process for the riskiest devices, a little bit less so for less risky devices that are equivalent to something that's already on the market. That's the 510K process, if that's something you've heard of, or it kind of just allows things on the market with notification if they're pretty low risk. But FDA serves a health and safety role, ensuring that things that get on the market are safe and effective. It also plays an innovation role by demanding the production of information about how well things work, how safe they are. That's costly information, and we probably wouldn't get anywhere near so much of it if FDA weren't involved demanding the information in the first place. Another big actor here is the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and by that I really just mean a stand-in for the patent system, right? In general, companies are, or at least firms developing biomedical innovations, recognize there's a lot of money that gets sunk into finding out, for instance, whether or not a drug works, whether a medical device is effective. But once we know that information, it's relatively easy to copy a drug or a medical device. And so the patent system provides an ex ante incentives via ex post exclusivity. The basic shtick is you get a patent, you can keep other people from using your invention for a period of time, from making or selling a generic version of your drug for a period of time, and therefore you can charge higher prices and recoup those upfront investment costs, including the millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions or billions of dollars that it takes to take one of these expensive innovations through FDA. And then finally, there's insurance reimbursement, which is to say, most of the time, a lot of these products, people aren't paying for them out of pocket. Consumers and patients aren't paying for them. Instead, this all goes through insurers, and reimbursement is key to the development of these biomedical products. Now, you might be wondering, what does this have to do with medical AI? And the whole point of this project and this thought is to think about, well, what's going on in medical AI and why is it so profoundly different from what we see in the kind of paradigmatic health technology space. All right, so turning to medical AI, who is it that's doing the innovation here? And I ask this because the most obvious answer is, well, all of you in this room are, but that's not the obvious answer from an innovation tech standpoint. If you're looking at innovation, you might think, oh, like who's doing the innovating? It's the big firms. You look at the list of who has FDA-approved devices, and it's companies like Arteris and Viz.ai and lots of other companies, well, not a lot, but a decent number of other companies that have these products approved. But of course, those aren't the only innovators. And what's so interesting about this from an innovation standpoint is how many other actors are creating things that are actually being used now. So I think about things like the University of Michigan Medicine School of Medicine, with its predictor for C. difficile, that's Jenna Ween's group. I think about Duke and its Forge Health Data in Action Center and the DHI group and the implication of Sepsis Watch. I think about not just universities, but electronic health records companies are getting into this. Epic and Cerner have their own medical AI and machine learning products that are embedded into their electronic health records. And even health insurers are getting into the action, sometimes developing their own products, but also in this fascinating development, showing up with venture capital groups, basically, where they are creating in-house venture capital organizations to develop medical AI, or at least to invest in the development of medical AI. So lots of innovators outside the kind of classic space of biomedical innovation. The other aspect along which this is different is the kind of spectrum of what medical AI and machine learning looks like. So I think about this in terms of how close are we to direct patient care? And the things that really get the most attention in terms of newspaper headlines, in terms of science articles, in terms of, frankly, from the legal side of things, how do we deal with this stuff, is the things that are very close to patient care. So stuff that's really involved in diagnosis or treatment. So identifying skin lesions for potential melanoma, recommending treatments, the whole IBM Watson, MD Anderson cancer thing. Obviously, there's a lot going on there, but the kinds of things that are really focused on are stuff like how do we impact patient care at the point of care? But there's a ton more that's actually involved where artificial intelligence and machine learning, and I use those terms relatively interchangeably. I know that's a whole thing. I'm not going to worry about it. Right. So these are involved in lots of other places farther from the direct point of patient care. So we've got prediction, say, of C. difficile infection, or of going into septic shock, or of hospital readmission after 30 days, or of death, or whatever it is that you're most interested in and have the data for. Triage and patient flow, figuring out when patients can be seen, by whom can they be seen, how can we move them through the emergency department faster and more efficiently. Electronic health record management, in terms of putting information into the electronic health record or getting information out of it that influences patient care, but it's not kind of the same sort of here's what we should do for this particular patient that we think about in the kind of paradigmatic example. Farther back, staffing. When are doctors and nurses going to be called off of rotation or onto rotation? And then even farther back, billing, which might sound, is that medical AI at all? But of course, the way things are billed profoundly impacts not only the finances of health centers and institutions and health insurers and patients, but also changes the way we get care. Depressing as it is, billing shifts patterns of care. And so AI that's billing AI is also going to impact patient care. So tons of artificial intelligence that has the potential to change a lot of the practice of medicine, and only a little bit of it is kind of at the sharp end of the stick, which is where a lot of attention gets focused. And so we're interested in kind of what happens with the rest of this, and what happens with the people creating medical AI who are not kind of big development companies. What do the legal regimes look like there? So let's turn to that now. And I'll start with the differences with respect to the FDA's oversight. The first question you might ask is, can software even be a medical device? The answer is emphatically yes. FDA has said that software can be a medical device for a long time. More recently, it's made the distinction between software in a medical device, that's like the software that powers your MRI machine, versus software as a medical device, saying standalone software can itself be considered a medical device, and indeed lots of it is, if it fits within the really broad definition of medical device, including things to prevent, mitigate, diagnose, or treat disease, which a decent amount of this stuff does, but of course not all of it. So lots of software can be medical devices, but of course lots of it is not going to actually be regulated by FDA for a relatively narrow definition of regulated. I should say up front, there's a lot of uncertainty going on here, but FDA is, in general, I think, less involved with the regulation of much of the medical AI and machine learning that I'm talking about here than with, say, the classic paradigmatic cases of drugs, physical medical devices, things like that. So a couple of reasons why FDA might not be showing up as much as one might think. The first is FDA has kind of general discretion in what it focuses on, and in particular, it focuses on products that are marketed and that are in interstate commerce. To the extent that a lot of the products that the folks in this room are working on, this virtual room, I should say, are working on, those often kind of don't go particularly far outside the walls of a particular institution. And if they're not kind of moving in interstate commerce or being marketed as commercial products, often FDA kind of doesn't worry about it as a matter of its own discretion, potentially statutory authority, but I'm going to focus on the discretion here. The other big exception, and this is kind of an exercise of discretion that has become customary and highly powerful, is that FDA has taken a hands-off approach to what are called laboratory-developed tests. Basically, back in 1976, when FDA got the authority to regulate medical devices in the first place, it said, hey, if there are diagnostic tests that are developed, manufactured, and used within one facility, we're not going to worry about it. Those are laboratory-developed tests. We're not going to enforce the regulatory requirements for pre-market approval or clearance or whatever. Initially, that was meant for very simple tests, but they've gotten broader, like blood counts, but they've gotten much broader over time. And a lot of the products that are, or the algorithms or the software that's being developed in the medical AI context seems like it falls under this definition. These are things where, the University of Michigan uses University of Michigan data to develop a product that is deployed within the walls of the University of Michigan. Hard to see how that doesn't count as a laboratory developed test if it otherwise would be considered a medical device subject to FDA regulation. Now, this is all at FDA's discretion. It could change its mind, but it hasn't for 45 years, and recent efforts to say maybe we should rethink this have met with a lot of resistance, and so the FDA still really doesn't touch much in the way of laboratory developed tests. The 21st Century Cures Act is also the latest congressional foray into this area. And Congress there basically said, hey, here's a bunch of stuff that's software but isn't a medical device. So things that are administrative support or promote a healthy lifestyle or are electronic health records that don't do analysis or transfer or store data without analysis, all of those don't count as medical devices. And the big one, at least closest to the sharp end, the patient care end of the stick, is that clinical decision support software that enables a provider to independently review the recommendation or analysis or conclusion or whatever, such that it is not the intention that the physician or other provider rely on the piece of software, also doesn't count as a medical device, which is to say, those things that say, hey, here's some information, doc, do what you'd like with it, and here's why we thought that, and the doctor, at least theoretically, could look and say, that's why they got to that conclusion. That doesn't count as a medical device. Now, obviously, there's a lot going on here, and it's not clear that doctors are actually going to do any of this review. Um, it's an intent-based question. This is kind of the squishy area. Interesting story about Duke Sepsis Watch product in particular, where apparently they developed the product in consultation with the FDA to make sure that there was enough opportunity for consultation with physicians, or the physicians had enough of an opportunity to review, that it fell into this loophole and therefore was not a regulated medical device. The last point, so the big conclusion I'll say here is, like, there's a lot of stuff here, whether it's on the back end administrative stuff or even on the front end, if it's just offering information and not intended to be fully relied on, that's not going to count as a medical device, and therefore FDA is unlikely to exercise a lot of regulatory authority over. But I'll say a caveat. A lot of this is maybes and unlikelies, and there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a reason there's a star next to device, which is to say FDA can say, hey, yeah, this is administrative support, but it impacts patient safety, and they can go through some procedures, and they can say, actually, we are going to regulate it. FDA could also revoke its enforcement discretion about laboratory developed tests. It hasn't, but it could. So this is an area where there's much less oversight by FDA than in kind of classical medical technology development spaces, although all that is subject to change. The next big regime I wanted to talk about is the patent system, because there's an interesting shift in the balance between patents and secrecy, and potentially trade secrecy here, right? On the one, if you're trying to keep something exclusive, if you want to keep an invention to yourself, there are two big options. One of them is I get a patent on it, and nobody else can use it for 20 years, but I have to tell the world what it is. That's the bargain with the patent system. Or I keep it secret and hope nobody else figures it out, and I can monopolize it as long as I can keep it secret. This is an area where patents are harder to obtain than they are in lots of other medical technologies. It's pretty easy to get a patent on a drug. It's relatively harder to get a patent on some form of AI product, principally due to a couple of doctrinal areas that I'm not going to go into in any real depth here. The first is, what can you patent? That's section 101, where the Supreme Court has said you can't patent laws of nature, you can't patent abstract ideas, and it's awfully tough to patent business methods. And a lot of the kinds of AI that I'm thinking about here really seem like they fit into those buckets, at least for pretty expansive definitions of laws of nature. Now, clever patent attorneys have figured out ways around this, but it's certainly harder to patent this type of technology than, say, drugs or physical medical devices. Section 112 also says, here's a bunch of stuff you have to disclose. Here's how you have to enable other people in the field to be able to make and use your device. That kind of disclosure is harder to make when we're talking about the opaque data-driven systems that characterize much of medical AI. Another challenge with the patent system is just the timeline, right? Patents are relatively slow. We're talking 20-year times. We're talking years to get them. AI moves pretty fast, and so the timelines just don't match up especially well. On the other side, this kind of stuff pretty easy to keep secret. The data are often proprietary, and the algorithms themselves are relatively proprietary. Even when they're published, lots of things aren't published about them, and so secrecy is a relatively more attractive. But the big incentive that we think about for technology, patents, not as strong as it normally is, or as they normally are. And the last thing I want to talk about is insurance reimbursement. Not quite as classically thought of as part of the big innovation law picture, but it's a big deal for medical technology because, again, lots of the stuff is too expensive for patients to afford on their own. And what I want to think about here is, again, this proximity to direct patient care. Things that are right at the sharp point of the stick, that diagnosis, that treatment area, you can imagine being reimbursed for those, right? Here I'm going to use this product to evaluate for the presence of a brain lesion, and I'll bill for that. That seems like it's a billable type of product. But all this other stuff, tough to think about how you write an insurance billing code for a general prediction about kind of, is any particular patient likely to be become septic in the near future, right? That's the kind of thing that's just gonna get wrapped into a general hospital facilities fee. But that means the incentives are quite different to develop it. And for an individual entity to develop it, especially an outside commercial entity, rather than, say, the hospital itself. Again, really different picture of what the incentives are like than what we might otherwise see. All right, so putting all of this together, what does this actually mean? Why do we care about these things? What are the implications? And so the first thing I'd say is the incentive picture here is quite a bit different. On the one hand, we've got lower incentives, probably because we don't have those big incentive levers of the patent system saying, here are goodies for you. Here's a monopoly. Here's a reward for developing this new product. But on the other hand, we've got lower hurdles to access. In particular, you don't have to do the thing where you spend tens or hundreds or of millions of dollars to run clinical trials and convince FDA that your product should be allowed on the market, because that's not what a lot of these things are doing. They're just being developed and then hopefully validated well and then deployed. And that's a cheaper and it's an easier process, particularly if you already have the data and the expertise in-house, than trying to demonstrate that a drug is safe and effective from scratch. So lower incentives, lower hurdles, different incentives, right? The kinds of incentives that say, well, I'm going to develop something that's going to more effectively drive the flow of patients, or I'm going to drive something that's going to try to decrease the number of 30-day readmissions I have because that's going to change my Medicare reimbursement rates. That's the kind of thinking that we might see from users in a system, hospitals, academic medical centers, places like that, rather than, say, third-party developers. So different actors developing different products. The other big point here is about oversight. And the interesting aspect is the kind of big things that we think, here is what's going to make sure health technology is safe and effective, are much less present in this space than they are for other types of health technology. FDA isn't absent. It's certainly present, whether it's talking to people or kind of looming in the background. But it's not like products that are developed and deployed in a single hospital, especially more as we get closer to the back end of things, but even things that are kind of moderately distant from patient care. It's not like those things are going through an FDA clearance process or an FDA pre-market approval process and have a federal agency full of hopefully experts in the field saying, yes, there's enough evidence for this. No, there's not enough evidence for this. Yes, this is safe. No, it's not safe. Now, that's not to say that I think these things aren't safe, but the safeguards that we have in the system for normal health technology are not present here. The other oversight mechanism that doesn't get talked about as much, but is also not as much present here, is the insurance system, right? One function of insurance is to pay for things, but insurers don't like to pay a lot for things that don't work. And so at least for some products, insurers, whether it's the public payers like the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or private payers like United Health or Blue Cross Blue Shield or whomever, those entities like to see evidence that something works, whether it's FDA approval or some other form of evidence, and they're not performing that role either for products that don't get reimbursed. So there's much less oversight. Now, is that a problem? Well, it depends on whether or not you think, yeah, everything's hunky-dory and things are all working and there aren't any problematic incentives in-house and everybody knows what they're doing and everybody has high-quality data and there aren't going to be issues, and if there are issues, it's easy to spot them. I'm not quite convinced that that's the case across the board. And so potentially we might find this relative lack of oversight at least somewhat troubling, or at least worth exploring more. This also, I think, all plays into what I think of as kind of data determinism, which is to say that the process of innovation in the context of medical AI and ML is going to be deeply shifted by, or deeply influenced by, who has the data and what those data say. So the most obvious aspect of this is bias. If you have a relatively smaller set of data, because you're a small health system or whatever, there's an increased likelihood of bias in that context. That feeds into the oversight area because it's harder to figure out whether or not that bias is going to actually be problematic. Transferability is also an issue when we have, obviously, data that are developed in different contexts, different formats, different patterns of information found in those data. And again, without the oversight mechanisms, without the strong disclosure incentives, at least potentially provided by the patent system, it is tough to know whether or not products are actually transferable, will be transferable, could be transferable without problems, or not. The last point I want to make on this kind of data determinism point is one about institutional inequity, which is to say, it's going to be easier for places that already have lots of their own data, for the Michigans and the Dukes and the Cerners and the Epics and the United Healths and the Optums of the world to participate in this type of innovation, but not as much for, say, community health centers, smaller academic medical centers, smaller hospitals, rural practices, and places like that. And to the extent that all of this is happening outside kind of a classical innovation context, the policy levers that we might normally think to pull to try to change that around and increase the availability of data or the equity of access or things like that are those levers are not so present. What we think instead, we might think about kind of investing in infrastructure for data sharing and data development, but that's the subject for another talk. The very last point is all of this is going to influence what kind of innovation we're going to get, for good and for ill, right? We might get products that are more developed at increasing revenue for wealthier patients because we don't expect to see reimbursement, which has kind of a increasing revenues by increasing the number of wealthier patients that come in and stay in a hospital's doors, because these products aren't going to be reimbursed by insurance in the same way. We might expect to see efficiency concerns trump quality concerns because quality is going to be harder to observe and there's less independent oversight to make sure it's there. I'm not suggesting we are going to see all of these things, but the different landscape means different questions are going to arise and different products and different tasks are likely to be tackled. So I'll close by saying thank you and by saying talk to me, or talk to us rather. I said it in the beginning and I'll say it again. This is a fascinating, interesting area where there's a lot going on and we only see part of the picture. So if there are examples that you think of yes, that's exactly what they're talking about, or no, that totally doesn't make sense at all, we would love to hear from you. Do you work with the FDA? Do you file patents on your innovations? I'd be interested in hearing. Personally, my email is wnp@umich.edu. But just to recap, this is a place where the way the law shapes and treats innovation is deeply, deeply different from the way that it does for lots of other biomedical innovation. We're still figuring out exactly how that works and exactly what problems are likely to arise. But for now, I just say this is a place of further study, and I hope you find it interesting as well. Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Bye-bye.